Richard Dad was a young British painter of huge promise who fell into mental illness while touring the Mediterranean in the early 1840s. He spent over 40 years in lunatic asylums, dying at Broadmoor in 1886, but never gave up his calling, producing mesmerizingly detailed watercolors and oil paintings, of which is now the most well-known. The picture's history encapsulates the peculiar rise and, if not fall then the suspension, of its maker's reputation, and indeed begs the question of what happens to any long-dead forgotten genius after they've been rediscovered. Among the symptoms of Dad's illness, which sounds today like a form of schizophrenia, were delusions of persecution and the receipt of messages from the ancient Egyptian deity Osiris. Dad was commanded to kill his father, or the demon who it appeared to him had taken his place, and did so with efficiency in the summer of 1843, not long after returning from his tour. After an equally well-planned escape to France, the artist was eventually admitted to the criminal lunatic department of Bethlehem Hospital in Lambeth, now the Imperial War Museum, and it was here that he painted the. According to the inscription on the back of the canvas, it took him 9 years to complete, although Dad qualifies this claim with sort of, which may mean he only worked at it on and off between 1855 and 1864. It is an exhaustingly complex image, with a substantial cast of characters, none of whom are doing much with the exception of the fellow himself, who is about to hew a hazelnut in half in order to provide the diminutive queen of the fairies, Mab, with a new chariot. Dad's starting point was evidently Mercutio's teasing speech in which he imagines in excruciating detail the nightly wanderings of Mab as she seeds dreams in sleepers' heads, nocturnal visions in which suppressed ambitions and desires reveal themselves. Dad's inscription further informs us that the picture was painted for the steward of Bethlehem, George Henry Haydon, and in a long poem, or at least rhymed catalogue, which the artist wrote in 1865, he gives a kind of cast list as well as offering an account of how the picture came to be painted. It was apparently Haydon who suggested some verse about the fairies as a point from which to throw, presumably the Mercutio speech, which may have been intended by the Bethlehem official as a means of encouraging Dad to revisit his early life before illness had struck, when he had made his reputation as a painter of Shakespearean fairy subjects. Victorian psychiatrists were in any case fond of writing on the cases described by the bard, and Charles Lamb observed how, despite the extravagant imaginative leaps of his fairy scenes, Shakespeare himself presented a kind of inverse monomania, maintaining the thread of sanity even through the most outlandish journeys of the mind. Having received the commission for a new fairy painting from Haydon, however, Dad says inspiration failed to materialize. He took the idea of spiritual inspiration very literally, seeing indeed the work of spirits in all human endeavor. Individuals and entire cultures may aspire to noble achievements, but the help or hindrance of the spirit world was what counted, and its genii were not inclined to submit themselves to human service for long. "What's the use of attempting the Enlightenment?" asked Dad in some notes written in the 1850s. "What a number of times the destroying angel has triumphed over the different nations of the earth, sucking them up and knocking them down." And equally for an artist seeking to pin down their genius and compel it to answer, what a clever angel the genius of painting must be to escape from all these hot pursuits, but once free, not all the arts of any old fellow I suppose can lure back the pretty bird to its own disgrace and bondage. Dad's theory of art was thus thoroughly pessimistic. The public were a waste of time, and one might fancy pictures are like monks secluded from and very little noticed by the world, so that after all what matters about its quality except to the few, the initiated. This might at least allow that Haydon may have been a worthwhile patron, but as for the artist himself, what more slavish than painting, what more hopeless? So when seeking to make a beginning of the fairy fella, Dad's only strategy upon realizing that fancy was not to be evoked from her ethereal realms was to accept his passive role, to entirely empty his mind, I thought on naught, a shift, as good perhaps as thinking hard. Finally the method succeeded, indefinite, almost unseen, lay vacant entities of chance, and gradually the design and composition evolved without intent. Dad's description of the painting, which he styled, thus has a curious sense of disavowal about it, as if saying who is in it is all he can do, their significance being beyond his explanation. When Dad comes to note the head of a man wearing a conical red cap, poking out of the landscape in the top left of the picture, he tells us that of the Chinese Smallfoot Society, he's a small member. But, if Confucius sent him now, I can't remember. The characters of the fairy fella are mainly arranged in pairs and clusters. A group of men watch the fella intently while over the lead actor's head is the patriarch with epic beard, along the elongated brim of whose crown cavort a troupe of dancers apparently in Spanish costume, and indeed Dad observes that one is dressed like de Duvernay, that is Pauline Duvernay, a flamenco dancer famous on the stages of 1830s London. On either side of the patriarch are pairs of maids and gallants, all showing an exaggeratedly gendered leg. Above the patriarch are Oberon and Titania, rival monarchs to Mab, who waits for her new chariot just below them to the left. She is, as Mercutio had described her, microscopic and yet painted by Dad with an entirely convincing series of miniaturized impressionist touches. In the upper left of the painting, strange creatures summon further witnesses to the great moment of the splitting of the nut, and then Dad offers, in the sequence of 7 figures along the top of the picture, a version of the counting rhyme whereby boys allowed fate to choose them a profession, or girls a husband, soldier, sailor, tinker, tailor, ploughboy, apothecary, thief. If there were a work intended for critical interpretation, which it probably was not, then we might talk of the suspended action with which the seed was to be split, the deferred moment of sex, the mutual isolation of the groups of figures suggesting the impossibility of generating a family or a community, and we might connect these themes to Dad's awareness of his own position as a long-stay patient in London's high-security lunatic asylum where, shut out from nature's game and banished from nature's book of life, because some angel in the strife had got the worse of fate, his lot was in a paradise of fools, too, contented live. But Dad knew, given the workings of spirits, angels and fate, that autobiography was a vain fiction, and we should be wary of assuming that his most famous picture must somehow be his personal testament, but that became Dad's most famous work because, in 1963, it entered the Tate collection where it was soon a popular favorite. It was presented to the gallery by the then elderly poet Siegfried Sassoon, who had himself been given it by his mother-in-law, the daughter of the vastly wealthy connoisseur Alfred Morrison, whose encyclopedic collections included several Dads. Sassoon had a special interest in the artist, having befriended, in the trenches, 3 brothers who were the grandsons of Richard, Dad's elder brother. There was presented to the Tate by Siegfried Sassoon in memory of his friend and fellow officer Julian Dad, a great-nephew of the artist, and of his 2 brothers who gave their lives in the First World War, a dedication which always still accompanies the painting today. Sassoon of course had yet further personal reason for taking an interest in Dad, having himself been a patient at Craig Lockhart outside Edinburgh, which functioned during the war as a hospital for shell-shocked officers. The arrival of at the Tate, allowing Dad a substantial audience for the first time since the 1840s, could not have been timed better if Sassoon had planned it, which he hadn't. He donated the picture to a public collection, having taken fright at the underhand tactics of an art dealer keen to relieve him of it. This was the period during which a new intellectual consensus was fermenting against the inherited system of 19th-century asylums, a consensus embracing everyone from the radical historian of psychiatry Michel Foucault to Enoch Powell, then British Secretary of State for Health. Dad, having been more or less, if never completely, forgotten since the onset of his illness, now appeared something of a hero, a brave survivor of a vicious system which, so went the news story, locked away all those with whom the Victorians could not cope, which was to say many. Dad appeared as the dark unconscious which underlay mainstream Victorian painting with its floppy maidens. Dad contrarily had a penchant for sturdy women, and limp-wristed draftsmanship. Dad's taut line was admired by some critics even when the world at large had forgotten him. The notorious magazine of 60s Counterculture ran a spread on the artist in 1971, and in 1974 Freddie Mercury used text from the poem for lyrics to a song titled The, which appeared on Queen's second album. But also in 1974 there appeared the results of a more sober, academic approach to Dad. Patricia Alderidge took up the new post of archivist to the ancient Bethlehem Hospital in the late 1960s and was able to recover much of Dad's forgotten biography and oeuvre, publishing her findings in the still indispensable catalogue to an exhibition devoted to the artist at the Tate. At this point, in retrospect, it seems the romanticized anti-psychiatry Dad on one hand, and on the other the history of Dad written from within the hospital itself, effectively cancelled one another out. At least, only the slightest amount of new research was published on the artist for decades after 1974. There seemed nowhere he might confidently be placed in the history of either art or psychiatry. So, how to deal with a long-dead forgotten genius once they've been rediscovered? If the talent in question never fitted in when alive, there's little chance a permanent plinth in the pantheon of their field will be found for them even once posterity has handed them their posthumous prize. Once the ghost is raised from obscurity, where can we lay it down again?